Hi everyone! Today we're talking about Soundscapes by Click, or video games, programming, and what you do when almost every single action in your game is tied to one button. Before we begin, I just want to say that this is a slice of a larger presentation, and everything that I say here may seem like a lot of background information, and that's okay. We need to get through the background information so that I can get to the main point of what I'm saying and give you the most context possible. The type of game that we're going to be looking at today is called a visual novel. Now, what exactly is a visual novel? Well, at its most basic, it's a choose-your-own-adventure book, except it's a video game. They're mostly made in Japan, Korea, and China. However, in recent years, original English visual novels have been made. And when I say recent years, I mean about the past decade. Translations of visual novels are typically available via localization, which means that the original text is translated into English. However, the audio usually stays in Japanese whenever they're voiced. Visual novels are usually in first person, meaning that the player is the main character, or abbreviated as the MC. Visual novels use static images of backgrounds and characters to tell a story rather than navigating through a world as you might do in a first-person shooter-style game or a third-person shooter-style game. You actually navigate via clicking through text. The player primarily spends their time reading rather than moving around or solving puzzles. Primary focus is reading, making choices, and when you click on that choice, it may take you down a branching path where you can get one of multiple endings. Sometimes visual novels are geared specifically towards men or women whenever there's a romance option involved, but that's a different conversation about assumed heterosexuality that we don't have time for in this presentation. Due to the nature of visual novels being static images, there are certain programming restrictions that we have to take into account when developing a game. For computer versions, all in-game commands are executed via the mouse. For console versions, there's usually one select button, and then you have one button that brings up the menu. Otherwise, that same button is what you're clicking over and over and over, press, 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 to go through text, 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 and read through the story. Some popular engines for PC are RenPy, Java, Unity Web Player, and when it was still running, Flash. It's now outdated and needs updating for those Flash games to be able to run. All of this leads us to the question: how do you program an entire soundscape for a game that uses static backgrounds, still images, and mostly one button? Well, the most effective way to do this is to program music and sound in visual novels to a click. The click is the cue, which means that it starts right on the click. This accounts for dramatic timing and player reading speed during the programming process, which is a big varying factor in how the player interacts with the game. Working with a single button as a primary means of cueing sound and music in a game means that players will hear or not hear sound and music based on their reading speed, the timing of that cue, and the length of the audio clip. Now, how do we make that work in creating an entire sound world? The game examples today that we're going to use to illustrate this are Psychedelica of the Black Butterfly, a game set in the limbo world between life and death; The House in Fata Morgana, a game set in a mysterious house that is nowhere and everywhere all at once; and Code Realize, which is a steampunk adventure game featuring reinterpreted characters from classic literature. Let's take a minute to look at Psychedelica of the Black Butterfly first. How might developers use sound and music to create environments that change with player interactions? Well, the first and most obvious is perhaps the branching path structure. Psychedelica, the Black Butterfly in particular, features a huge map that lays out the structure of the game for the player to see, and that's how you navigate scenes. This is a little unusual in the visual novel world. Normally you don't navigate via a flowchart, you simply jump in by chapter. However, it's a great illustration of the different types of branching paths, and it also illustrates how a player can make multiple different choices and hear different soundscapes along the way. For example, if you make one choice, it might take you to the garden, where you'll hear something that sounds like this. Another choice might lead you to a bad ending or a dangerous place, which might cue up music that sounds something like this. We know from our understanding of film music that music that is tense or fast-paced may have something to do with danger. We know what danger sounds like as players. You know that you have to make the correct choice or else your death may be imminent, and yes, you can in fact die in visual novels if you make the wrong choice enough times. This is a great example of how music in visual novels is at the intersection of film music and traditional video game music. The term player-constructed soundtrack is frequently used in video game music studies because it implies that the player has some agency over the music that they hear. In visual novel games, they certainly do. However, it's not the same as whenever you're running around an open world type area and you can choose where you're going, which enemies you encounter or don't encounter, and which buttons you push to trigger certain effects within the game. For visual novels, the music is a careful collaboration of player choice and developer intention. If the player makes a certain choice, the developer then intends for you to hear a particular kind of music. We've mentioned before that music in visual novels can be similar to theatrical music, and a wonderful game that utilizes this very well is The House in Fata Morgana. So, what happens when developers want specific music for a scene, like film music? Oftentimes we get themes for individual characters, such as Michael's theme, which features whispering in the background, which is actually in French. Michael's full name is Michael Bollinger. He's a French character. Let's take a listen.
Et toi seul me prenais en pitié. Je me noyais. Je me laissais porter sans essayer de comprendre ta haine. En fait, j'aurais dû vous faire face depuis longtemps. À Gisèle.
However, no matter how well you may compose all of these different motives and use all of these different film conventions, player reading speed is still an issue. If you have someone who reads very fast, like I do, they're probably not going to be able to hear the entire track in the first listening. It may take several playthroughs, or they may simply have to stop and pause if they want to hear the entire audio track in one listen. Alternatively, players who read more slowly may hear the track multiple times. Thus, the best way to ensure that players actually hear motives and sounds, and the best way to utilize any dramatic timing that the composer would like to do, is to program it on the click and to put those motives and that timing at the very beginning of the piece. A great example of this dramatic timing is a piece called Vera Menchia, which is in The House in Fata Morgana. It starts with a suddenly loud note that coincides with a dramatic moment in the story. This timing will only work right at the beginning because we can only ensure that the player is going to read the dramatic moment in the text at the same time as the audio if it's timed directly to the click. It's the only way to make sure that it's at the exact same time. Otherwise, there's no way to know how fast the player is going to read and when exactly they're going to hear this music. The last part of creating a visual novel sound world is the sound effects themselves that are not music. So how do developers integrate sound effects into a plot? Well, again, due to player reading speed variation, the only reliable way to time these sound effects is on the click. However, a great amount of Foley artistry does go into creating these effects, such as the melting sound of a lock whenever our main character is attempting to escape a mansion in Code Realize. The sizzling sound of the lock is timed immediately after the player makes the choice to melt the lock. This coincides with danger music, which means that the player has in fact made the wrong choice. What this also means is that developers have to be very careful how they split the text whenever they put these games together, because it's a very intimate relationship between text, music, and sound. In visual novels, they all work together to create these sound worlds. This was just a quick rundown of the kind of programming considerations that go into visual novels. Just a reminder, sounds and music can only be reliably incorporated when they start on click and immediately play. Player engagement with sound and music in visual novels is primarily affected by their reading speed. Remember that the way that the player interacts with choices and the way that they create their own soundtrack is different in game due to the fact that visual novels are static and primarily read material. Thank you all for your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.